And first and foremost, what we're going to hit on the salary cap implications that were announced today. The NFL and the NFLPA have agreed to a $208 million, I think it's minimum cap hit for next season for NFL teams. If the Chargers are able to carry over about $10 million ish, depending on, what else they do from here on out, they could be looking at $50 million in cap space next season without cutting anyone. So Tyler, what's your takeaway there in terms of cap space possibilities for the Chargers next year?
Well, my first thought was, what does Devontae Adams cost these days? When you have a lot of money, you just want to spend it. Yeah. Spot Rack has him at $25 million a year, which is absolutely insane. So I don't know if they're spending that much money, but they could. As far as the free agent market goes next season, well, one, the Chargers roster, there's not a whole lot they'll do to do changes. Like maybe they'll, extend Ibushi, but otherwise they're probably cutting Bulaga, and the right tackle market is okay with like Taylor Moton and Ryan Ramczyk. Not super expensive. I mean, they are, but not $25 million a year for Devontae Adams expensive. One guy I'd love for them to potentially bring in is Darius Williams, the Rams corner, just because if Chris Harris leaves and they want Asante Samuel Jr. have some inside-outside, maybe they just want that established, outside guy who was opposite Jalen Ramsey with the Rams. Now, granted, we always thought that, not always, but we thought this offseason that Staley would bring in some of his guys, and he didn't. Right. But I do think that bringing in someone like Williams, who's relatively young-ish, who just kind of plug and play, doesn't have to really be like the high-end starter, just a guy opposite Davis or working with Asante Samuel Jr. I think that would definitely be a target. But otherwise, I'm just excited that the Chargers have this much space. If they want to trade for Julio Jones, it's even easier next year because that cap hit ain't that much. It also does mean that they could extend Mike Williams as well. And, they do definitely have the cap space to do that. So we'll see how that plays out. But for right now, as far as their roster goes, I don't expect a whole lot of changes outside of Bulaga. So I'm just looking at additions. And there's some guys, whether it be, Akeem Hicks, maybe from Chicago, that I would be interested in.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the ceiling is $208 million. So it's not like the floor. Yeah. So, but currently over the cap has $203 million as the cap. So basically the Chargers would jump from $46 million cap space to about 51. So, I mean, that's pretty good for them. Obviously, if they want to make some moves, it allows you flexibility if they do want to make a big trade or something like that. Obviously, like we've been talking about with Julio, or some opportunity that becomes open next year, and they don't really have that many free agents to re-sign, right? I mean, the one that's kind of borderline is Mike Williams, depending on how all that plays out. And if you're paying him, let's say, even between 10 and 15 million, I think at that point, then you're at 35, right? And you still have a pretty decent chunk of change there. So then at that point, you really have Linval Joseph and Chris Harris, which I don't think would be particularly expensive to re-sign, at least in comparison to Mike. So they can go pretty crazy on the market. Obviously, I think there's a lot of great defensive tackles if they do want to move on from Joseph, kind of in that market. But there's also guys that aren't really going to be available. TJ Watt is in the free agent class, but we all know that Steelers are going to lock him down. I sort of have that view of Devontae Adams too, but also TBD on that. But I think they can be big spenders in free agency, and for all the crap that Spanos gets for being cheap, or the Telesco regime is for being cheap, they weren't cheap this year, right? They made obviously Corey Linsley the highest paid center for about 3 minutes until the guy from who was the other guy that got paid?
Graham Glasgow.
Yeah, Graham Glasgow of the Lions. Yeah. So, but they showed this offseason, and I honestly last offseason, that they weren't afraid to spend money. And I think that that's kind of going to be the thing going forward for them as a team with a quarterback with a rookie contract.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this a bunch last year about the flexibility that they're going to have because of the Justin Herbert contract. And I mean, having $50 million in cap space, potentially 60 if you cut Brian Bulaga, which kind of depends on how he plays. I mean, it gives you a ton of options. If you want to go for another big swing like Lindsey at a different position, you can certainly do that. They'll also have to take into consideration a Derwin James extension, which we'll talk about him in a minute, and then, potentially bringing back Mike Williams. So it gives them so much flexibility for the future. And, we've been kind of talking about recently being, next year being the big push for the Chargers. And that's a big reason why. because, you know, I'm glad that Tyler brought up Darius Williams. You know, we kind of are looking at this roster and maybe you have enough money to go get a top tier corner. Maybe you have enough money to go get a top tier edge rusher, go get Justin Herbert another weapon. And so the Chargers will be able to hit several of their needs in free agency. And then, you know, this year they didn't really have the luxury of taking best player available in the draft, but next year they probably will be able to do that because of all this cap space moving forward. So whether that's a trade for Julio Jones or whatever the case may be, you know, that's a big deal. And it's going to give the Chargers so much flexibility beyond that because the cap is going to go up again in 2023 and theoretically again in 2024. So across Herbert's 5-year rookie deal, the Chargers are going to have a ton of cap space and they're going to be in a situation that they have really never been in.
I hate to bring it back to Julio every single time, but potentially if they do give those 2 picks or 3 picks, whatever for Julio, they can definitely mitigate that loss or that gaping hole by just spending money, which is great. And also, just want to point out that Ryan Dyrud, friend of the show on LAFB, pointed out that the Chargers might have $50 million in cap space. The Rams are $10 million over the cap next season. There's a big difference in money there.
Yeah, I mean, they have a bunch of compensatory picks too. Obviously, like even if you do make the Julio trade and you give up all those picks, you do still have bodies. Like it's not the same quality players, but I'm kind of the opinion that like the top of next year's draft isn't that great. From what I've seen so far, at least in comparison to this one. Like if we want to talk about first round receiver in this year's draft means a whole different thing than what it means next year. It just isn't the same thing. But so yeah, I'm of the proponent that they might be bigger players definitely in free agency next year than they are in really a draft context for sure.
Yeah, and the other thing, I'm glad you brought up the compensatory picks, is because of COVID, there were so many draft eligible players that returned to school this year. And so I think this year was kind of, you know, one of the low points in terms of players that were declared for the draft, and next year that number is going to go up as well. So, you know, we kind of joke about those 6-round picks, but I mean, theoretically with the depth of the draft class, you know, that could be some, or at least one potential difference maker. So the other thing with the Julio Jones, just briefly, we've kind of hammered home, you know, our opinions on it. But I think it's Jeff Darlington of ESPN was reporting yesterday that he thinks it might not even cost a 1st-round pick to go get Julio Jones. It might not even cost a 2nd-round pick, that this could be trending towards being a couple 3rds or even later than that. So the Chargers currently do not have great odds. If you're a betting person and buy into how likely that correlation is, their odds, I think, are like 7th or 8th most likely. You know, the Titans and Patriots and other teams have kind of taken the lead, but we'll obviously cover that the more it progresses.